In this presentation, we will explore the meaning of education and the scope of education as a field of study. This presentation is basically aimed at the students of education or the students who are interested in understanding the concepts of education, the concepts of teaching and learning, and the philosophy behind the processes of education. Generally, students of teacher education or students of education will be interested in understanding these concepts. So first, the meaning of education. So generally we can understand education in terms of it being a process and in terms of it being a discipline or a field of study. So first, as a process, we can say that education is both a process and it is a discipline or a field of study. As a process, generally, education refers to the acquisition or transmission of knowledge, skills, values, and cultures from one generation to another. And the aim of this process is to develop the individuals and the societies in line with certain objectives, individual objectives or social objectives, or you can say political objectives. Now, as a discipline of study, what is education? As a discipline of study or as a field of study, or you can say as a branch of knowledge that is specially studied at the higher education level, it is a systematic area of academic inquiry, and this particular field or academic area examines things such as, for example, what is the nature of learning and what is the nature of teaching, what is education, how do people learn, how teaching should be organized, and how educational institutions functions and how should they function. So these are questions. These are some of the important questions that we can find answers to or that we can explore in the discipline called education or the field of study that we call education. The meaning of education basically also tells us that education is, you can say, a multidiscipline area. And so it draws knowledge from multiple disciplines, such as, for example, some of the important disciplines where education can draw from include psychology, sociology, philosophy, history, economics, political science, and anthropology. Similarly, there are many other concepts in the natural sciences wherefrom the field of education can draw concepts and inspirations and questions. So these are areas that help us in the field of education to understand the theory and practice of education. For example, so we will actually discuss these areas in a bit of detail when we go into the scope of education in a while. So thus, we can say that education as a field of study means the scientific and philosophical investigations into the aims of education, the processes of education, the outcomes or the results of the processes of education, and the structure of education. Now, what is the scope of education as a field of study? This is something that we will discuss now. Scope basically means the subject area in which a particular field of study is interested. So what is it that we study when we talk about education? So what comes in the scope of education? So as we said that it is a multidisciplined area, therefore the scope of education as a field of study is wide and it is interdisciplinary, and so we draw on several subjects. This subject covers the theoretical and practical and applied aspects of the concept of education. The scope of education includes several disciplines, other disciplines, for example, philosophy. So education has, the scope of education includes thinking about and exploring the philosophical foundations of education. So for example, in this one, we study the nature, the aims, and the values of education. So what is education? This is a philosophical question. What should be the aims of education, and what are the aims of education? What are the values that we want to promote through education? These are questions of philosophy. Generally, this aspect of education, or the philosophical aspect of education, addresses fundamental questions. For example, what are the aims of education? What should be taught? How should education shape human life? And so on. The scope of education also includes the historical foundations of education. So in this aspect actually examines the evolution of educational systems in a particular society or globally. So besides education systems, what is the historical evolutions of educational institutions and the ideas across cultures and time periods? So how have educational ideas shaped, changed, and evolved over periods of time? And similarly, when we study the historical foundations of education, it helps us in understanding our present practices in educational institutions in the light of the past practices or past cultures of education. The psychological foundations is another area, another important area where we study basically individuals. So how individuals learn, what is the process of learning from a psychological perspective, how individuals develop, how, for example, students develop. And so some of the sub-concepts that come under this category include, for example, studying the concepts of students' motivation or learner motivation. What factors motivate students to learn, to get involved in the process of education? What are demotivating factors? Similarly, memory, an important concept of education. It helps, this field helps us in understanding memory as an important concept of education. Similarly, intelligence, an extremely important concept of education that we need the understanding of psychology in order to understand the nature of intelligence and to adjust educational processes accordingly. Personality, a very important concept of education. Teachers need to understand the personalities of the students. And so for that, we need the help of the field of psychology. Similarly, individual differences, the concept that students come from different backgrounds, they are different biologically, sociologically, economically. And so we need to understand those individual differences in order to make the process of education important, you can say authentic. And so that is why psychology is one of the foundational subjects that we need to, that comes in the scope of education. Then sociological foundation. So here what we do is it helps us in exploring the relationship between education and society. Every system of education is basically developed in the light of the needs of the society, the requirements of the society. Therefore, sociological foundations comes in the scope of education. It deals with the socialization, for example, the concepts such as equality or inequality, stratification, unification, cultural transmission and cultural transformation, and social mobility. These are some of the concepts that teachers need to know, that educators need to know, and therefore this is one of the important focuses or that comes in the scope of education as a field of study. Then economic foundations. Again, we need to study the economic foundations of education. And so we can say it's there in the scope of education. Why? Because education basically aims at the economic development of the society and the individual as well. So we can say that when we look at it philosophically, we can think that this aspect considers education as an investment in human capital. It helps us in studying the role of education, for example, in the national economic development in terms of giving employment or producing opportunities for employment, productivity, and economic growth. Next, the political foundations of education. So every education is generally, you can say, one of the outcomes of a political system. Various political system, for example, a democratic political system will impact the processes of education. And you can say the education system itself will then impact the kind of political system or political culture that we see in a particular society or in a particular state or country. So the political foundations basically help us in examining, for example, how policies, including educational policies, how governance and political ideologies shape the process of education, the aims of education, and the outcomes of education. Generally, when we consider political foundations, we consider issues like, for example, democracy, human rights, equity, and educational reform. So overall, we can say that political foundations is an important area that comes in the scope of education as a field of study. Now, the field of education also includes comparative and international education, or the study of comparative and international education. Again, this is important. Why? Because we need to learn from other educational systems. We need to compare. We need to compare, for example, less developed education systems with highly developed, or more, you can say, more successful education systems. So here we study educational systems, for example, of different countries in order to understand similarities, to understand differences, and to learn from and adopt best practices across various countries and cultures. Then the other important area that comes in the scope of education as a field of study include curriculum studies. So, for example, we need to focus on the design and the implementation and the evaluation of curriculum. So what type of curriculum is needed? How to design that curriculum? What are the practical implications of designing a particular type of curriculum? What are the practical issues in the implementation of that type of curriculum? And how to evaluate that curriculum or how to evaluate student outcomes at the end of the implementation of the curriculum. So the curriculum studies area of education actually examines the relevance of the curriculum or the education system. It establishes balance, and it also helps us in examining learner-centered, for example, applying learner-centered approaches, which are generally considered more useful ways of imparting education. Lastly, the scope of education also includes the study of educational administration and management, again a very important area. Why? Because administration is an important area of the field of education. Generally, better education systems have better administration and management systems. So this area basically helps us in the organization of the education system, in studying effective educational leaderships, and in the functioning of the educational institutions. Generally, the field of educational administration and management deals with, for example, planning, policy making, financing, and evaluation. All of these areas, planning, policy making, finance, and evaluation, need to be effectively understood in order for an education system to become an effective education system that can help the society grow and develop. Lastly, research in education also comes as a very, very important area or in the scope of education as a field of study or as a discipline. So here, what happens is that, like other scientific fields or social fields of life, education needs to employ the scientific methods to study the educational problems. For example, some of the problems include the effectiveness, the degree of effectiveness of education, for example, certain teaching methods or styles, certain curricula, and similarly, diversity or inclusion and equity in education. These areas, when we study these scientifically through the process of scientific research, that is something that will help us in improving the concept and processes and outcomes of education. And so when we conduct research in the field of education, this research could be qualitative in nature, this could be quantitative research, there could be research design where we make use of both using the pragmatic paradigm. And again, the aim of conducting research in education is to improve teaching, learning, to improve educational theory, to improve educational policies and practices. So educational research is also an important area that comes in the field of education. So these are important areas that come in the scope of education as a field of study.